One day in the spring of 2006, a detective stood next to a refrigerator inside of a police station holding a little container full of evidence. She knew that what she was about to do represented a breach of protocol, but that was not going to stop her. Because she was working her first murder case, she was afraid that she wasn't going to be able to catch the killer. So she had decided that she was going to run her case her way, no matter what. She knew she was supposed to send this container to the state crime lab for analysis, but she wasn't going to do that. Instead, she placed the container inside of the refrigerator and then shut the door. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast. Because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please wait until the follow button has gone on vacation and then put a for sale sign up in front of their property. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of Wednesday, April 12, 2006, dark arrived. John Wiolinisi finished up his final exam of the day at his dental practice in the rural community of Blairsville, Pennsylvania. He handed his patient a toothbrush, told her to come back in 6 months, and then headed into his back office to wrap up. He turned off his computer and made sure he had everything he needed. The next day was his day off, and he didn't want to have to come back because he forgot something. Once he was satisfied, he flicked off the light, walked out through reception, and told the receptionist to have a great night. She waved and he gave her a big smile. But as soon as John walked out the front door, he let the smile drop off his face. He had a lot of problems recently, and pretending to be happy all day was pretty exhausting. And just because he'd finished work for the week did not mean he could relax now. In fact, it was the opposite, because waiting for John back at home was a legal document that he could barely even stand to look at it. But he knew that tomorrow he was finally going to have to deal with it. John had been trying to psych himself up for this, telling himself it would mark the beginning of a new phase of his life, but it was still very painful. He got into his car, turned on the ignition, pulled out of the parking lot, and began making his way home. It was about a half-mile drive from the dental practice to his house. Blairsville was a tiny little borough, which is like a town not far from Pittsburgh, and it was mostly farmland with rolling fields of corn and less than 3,500 residents. John had actually grown up here and then left at some point, but it had always been his lifelong dream to eventually come back home and raise a family here. When he graduated from dental school 13 years earlier, he could have set up shop in a big city and made a much higher salary right off the bat. But instead he took what was to him an even better deal. He joined the practice of his own childhood dentist right in downtown Blairsville. And it would turn out that John actually was able to make a lot of money right here in his hometown. Once John joined this practice, the practice took off, in part because John himself was incredibly charming and funny, and especially good with kids. He became the go-to dentist for whole families, and pretty soon he was earning more than he could even spend. He invested in real estate and eventually became a millionaire by the time he was in his 30s. But it was not until John met his wife, Michelle, that his life finally felt complete. John thought Michelle was one of the most beautiful people in the world. She had dark curly hair and striking blue eyes. When he met her, she was a single mother of 2, and to John that was great because it meant, basically, she came with a ready-made family. Now, John's friends were worried that Michelle only wanted John for his money, but when his mom got sick with cancer, Michelle immediately became her full-time caregiver. And for John, that was all the proof he needed that she did truly love him. John and Michelle got married in 1997, and shortly after that, they adopted a little boy named JJ and then moved into a big house with a pool. Everything had seemed perfect, but now John pulled into his new driveway, turned off the ignition, and just sat there, staring at the modest little brick home where he was currently living. He still couldn't understand how everything had fallen apart so completely. John was suddenly tight on money, and his childhood dentist, who was now his business partner, was talking about dissolving their partnership. John had lent tens of thousands of dollars to a bunch of people, and now he was having to ask for it back. And he and Michelle had hit a rough patch that just didn't tend, and they both admitted to having affairs. They were now living separately, which was why John was here at this small house instead of coming home to his big house with the pool. But of all the stressors in John's life, The worst one by far was that John was absolutely convinced that someone was going to murder him. Now, this fear had not come totally out of nowhere. A couple of weeks earlier, someone had vandalized John's car with spray paint, and the police had not been able to figure out who did it. And with all the other bad stuff going on in John's life, John had not been able to get over this vandalism. And he slowly became 100% certain that because of this vandalism, it signaled that he was going to get killed in his murder, like the vandalism would go unsolved. And he became so sure of this that he sent his attorney $10,000 and told her to use it to investigate if he just suddenly wound up dead. John finally got out of his car and walked up his porch steps and into the house. Then he closed the door behind him and locked it. It felt so empty now without his adopted son JJ, who John went long stretches without seeing these days. John had renovated one of the upstairs bedrooms for JJ, who was 5 years old, and he even bought a TV and video game console for them to play together that he was going to give him at Christmas. But Christmas had long passed. It was now April, and those Christmas gifts he had bought for JJ were still sitting unopened in a corner. This coming weekend was Easter, and John was hoping to finally see JJ again and give him these late Christmas presents that would cheer him up. John took off his shoes and walked into his living room. There on the coffee table, he saw the legal document that he had been avoiding because it represented the end of the life he had worked so hard to build. The document was a stack of divorce papers. Michelle had filed for divorce 3 years earlier, in 2003, but she and John hadn't been able to come to an agreement. They were not fighting to save the marriage. Both of them knew it was broken beyond repair. Michelle was already living with a new boyfriend, a Pennsylvania state trooper named Kevin Foley. What John and Michelle were fighting over was JJ. Michelle wanted full custody, but John was not about to just give up his son. But in less than 24 hours, it would all be over. Their lawyers had finally settled on a shared custody agreement, and Michelle had signed it. Tomorrow it would be John's turn, and the finality of it all was really starting to hit John. He sat down on the couch and turned on the TV, but he was feeling too restless to watch, so he called his aunt, who he was very close to, and he talked with her for a while about the divorce. She tried to make him feel better, but there really wasn't much she could say that would do that. And then when he put the phone down, John just sort of felt like, you know what? I just have to find a way to get through tomorrow, no matter how bad it is. He knew what he should be doing right now is actually reading through the divorce papers one more time, but he was just too tired, so he just stretched out on the couch and fell asleep. And when his back door creaked open, he didn't even hear it. The following day, around 3:30 p.m., a 9-year-old boy named Zacchaeus, who lived next door to John, walked out the front door of his parents' house and across the lawn towards John's house. It was a warm and sunny day, and Zach wanted to play with John's son JJ. Now, JJ hadn't been around for quite a while, but he did split time between his mother and father's homes, and so Zach had no idea if JJ was here today, but he figured it was worth a shot. But before Zach even climbed up the front steps to John and JJ's house, he saw that something was wrong. There was broken glass all over the porch in front of the door. Zach paused for a second and scanned the porch, looking for where this glass came from, and he noticed the little glass panel to the left of the door had been shattered. When he squinted, he realized there were streaks of red liquid dried right underneath the broken panel and also in the glass itself. Suddenly, Zach's throat got tight and his pulse quickened, and he thought about running away. But he couldn't just leave his friend JJ and his dad if they were in some kind of trouble. So Zach slowly and nervously climbed up the steps to the door and tried the doorknob. But he found it was locked. As carefully as he could, Zach stuck his hand through the broken glass panel and reached up and unlocked the deadbolt. Then he pulled his arm back out, turned the doorknob, and opened the door. At first, when Zach stepped inside the house, he couldn't really process what he was even looking at. There were papers strewn all over the floor, and Zach could clearly see JJ's dad. But JJ's dad, John, was laying motionless, face up on the floor inside the living room. It took Zach a second to realize that the floor all around John was soaked with blood, and when Zach looked more closely at John, he realized John's throat had been slit from ear to ear to ear. Zach turned and ran. About 15 minutes later, Janelle Liddick of the Blairsville Borough Police Department was driving with her husband and 4 kids when she got a call from police dispatch. A 911 call had come in from a normally quiet residential street. Dispatch just said there apparently had been a cardiac arrest, and so Corporal Liddick was needed right now at the scene. Corporal Liddick tried to get more information to determine, how urgent this was, but there really wasn't any more information. And so she made the decision to just go straight there with her family still in her car. But the second she pulled up at the scene and got out of her car, she could tell that this could not just be a heart attack, because she could see there was a patrol officer waiting for her on the porch and his face looked grim. Liddick quickly walked towards him, undressed what was going on, and he just pointed at the broken glass and the blood on the porch, and then told her, "Just go inside and see for yourself." So Liddick, who was pretty apprehensive at this point, stepped inside the house and she saw the foyer was splashed with blood all over the floor and the walls. And there, lying on the ground in the middle of the living room, was a horribly mutilated dead body. Right away, Liddick knew this had to be a murder, not only because the body was mutilated, but because she could clearly see numerous stab wounds all over the body, so many that there was no way this person could have self-inflicted. And even though Liddick had never handled a homicide case before, she knew immediately that what she needed right now was backup. Because dispatch had somehow recorded this 911 call as a cardiac arrest, the police had not sent a full emergency response, and so Liddick and the patrol officer outside were the only people on the scene. Liddick was worried that the killer could still be in the area or maybe in the house, and now she realized she had brought her kids with her. So she sent the patrol officer into the house to search it, while she went back outside to the front yard to stand between the murder scene and her family, guarding them with her gun. It was not long before a fleet of police cars, fire trucks, and ambulances descended on this quiet residential street. At the same time, the patrol officer who had searched the house came outside to report that it was empty. The killer, whoever they were, was gone himself. The only thing the officer had found was a huge puddle of blood in the basement where the victim clearly had bled through from the floor above. Once her backup arrived on scene and she had sent her family home, Corporal Liddick went back inside the house to assess just what kind of crime scene she was looking at. By now she had the victim's name, John Wyalini C. As the crime scene technicians started their work processing the physical evidence, Liddick began a slow walk through each room, trying to get a sense of who John was and how he died. John's body was close to the front door, but it was clear that the attack that preceded his death had been long and chaotic. There was blood all over the floor in the living room, which was strewn with papers, and when Liddick looked more closely, she realized these papers were divorce papers, and they too were covered in blood. Despite John being found barefoot, there were bloody shoe prints leading from the living room through the dining room towards the back door. They were too big to belong to the boy who had found the body, so Liddick figured they must belong to the killer. The crime scene technicians were already measuring the prints to determine the killer's shoe size. As Liddick continued to walk around, she didn't see anything that she thought could have been used as a murder weapon. She also didn't see any evidence of a robbery. Electronics that she could see were out in the open, so they weren't taken. No drawers or cabinets appeared to have been opened, and none of the closets looked like they had been rifled through. And so to Liddick, it really did not appear that this was a robbery, not only because of what she was seeing in terms of things not being taken, but also more specifically just how gruesome the crime was. I mean, to stab someone over and over and over again and mutilate their bodies, that is personal. That's not just some robber who happened upon John in the process of the robbery. So very likely, whoever the killer was, the only thing they wanted to do when they entered this home was for John to die. Liddick finished her sweep of the scene, ending up back in the living room where it looked to her like the attack had most likely begun, and that's when she noticed a check lying on the coffee table. She had overlooked it somehow before, but now she bent over to read it. The check was made out to the victim, John Wyalini C., for the amount of $15,000 from the bank account of somebody named Melissa Wyuse. When she saw this last name, Liddick did a double take. Wyuse was the last name of the boy, the neighbor who had discovered the body. She wondered if Melissa Wyuse was related to that boy. Attached to this check was also a note asking John to hold off for a few days before depositing it. And so at this point, Corporal Liddick had two good leads. The first lead was her victim clearly was in the middle of a divorce. And the second lead was someone, maybe his next-door neighbor. Whoever this Melissa Wayuse person was, owed him a lot of money that apparently she could not quite afford to pay back just yet. It was evening by the time Liddick stepped back outside the house, and when she did, she saw a crowd of neighbors and reporters jostling each other on the street. Blairsville almost never had murders, and she knew this was going to be a big story. She needed to head back to the station to get organized for interviews tomorrow, but before she could walk down the steps, one of the other officers on scene came up to her with an update. Police had fanned out to question the neighbors and see if they had heard anything, and they come back with two very interesting stories. The first account came from a woman who said that around 1:30 that morning, she had heard a scream. It woke her up and she had run to check on her kids, but her kids had been fine, so she had just gone back to bed, thinking she was just being jumpy. The second account came from another neighbor who had heard something a bit more specific. Right around the same time that first neighbor had heard the scream, or maybe a little bit after that. This neighbor heard a man yelling in what sounded like a heated argument. The neighbor couldn't make out everything the man said, but they definitely heard one sentence very clearly, and that was, "I'll never loan you money again." Instantly, Liddick thought of the $15,000 check on the coffee table. The officer had one more important piece of information for Liddick in addition to these witness statements. A lot of John's neighbors had told the police that there was one family on the block that detectives should really look into, and that was the Wayuse family. The Wayuse boy, Zach, was the one who found the body, and it was his mother, Melissa Wayuse, whose name was on that check. And there was one more member of the Wayuse family, and that was Melissa's husband, Tom. Tom was in the Navy and he was away a lot, but over the last 24 hours he had been home, so he was here when John was killed. Critically, the neighbors told the cops that there were rumors that Melissa Wayuse and John Wylini C. were having an affair. And so when Liddick heard this, she knew exactly where her investigation was going to start. The following day, April 14th, Liddick had Melissa and Tom Wayuse brought down to the station and put in an interview room for questioning. At this point, so early in the investigation, Liddick was casting a very wide net. She had never done a murder case before, but she was methodical by nature and liked to do everything slowly and thoroughly. She even talked slowly in a kind of monotone voice, and she didn't like it when anyone tried to rush her. So, her plan was to go pretty hard at Melissa and Tom Wayuse because of that $15,000 check, the rumors of the affair, and the witness account of a fight about low money on the night of the murder. But Liddick was also very interested in John's soon-to-be ex-wife, Michelle. The night before, Liddick had sent a police officer to tell Michelle that her husband was dead. But when the officer got to Michelle's house, he found that she somehow already knew, although she said she had heard that John died of a heart attack. The officer had broken the news to Michelle and her boyfriend, Kevin Foley, who was there, that no, John had actually been murdered. And when he told them that, Michelle had seemed, or at least acted, genuinely shocked. Corporal Liddick actually knew Michelle's boyfriend, Kevin Foley, personally because he was a state police trooper. They had worked together, and at one point, she had quite literally trusted him with her life. But in a murder case, the divorcing spouse and their new partner are always suspects no. 1 and 2, and Liddick knew that. However, before she began grilling Kevin or Michelle with some hard questions, she decided she would first eliminate all other suspects. She also wanted to get the results of the autopsy which was being conducted that day. Basically, she wanted to be really thorough before she went in on Kevin and Michelle. So now Liddick walked into the interview room where John's neighbors, Melissa and Tom Wayuse, were waiting side by side at a table. Liddick sat down and began very bluntly by asking what was the deal with that $15,000 check Melissa had written to John. Melissa answered in a very shaky voice. She explained that she and John had been friends since 9th grade, and she was planning to open up a new bakery in town, and John had loaned her the $15,000 to help her out. But then, sort of out of nowhere, he had asked for the money back. Melissa said she had been very disappointed, but at the same time, she knew John was in the middle of a long and probably quite expensive divorce. So she understood. She'd only had $14,000 in her account when she wrote that check. And so she had said that's why she'd left that note for John asking him not to cash it for a few days while she got the last $1,000. Together, Liddick watched Melissa closely as she gave her statement, and she decided that if Melissa was lying, she was doing a very convincing job of it. She sounded genuinely distraught over John's death and like the money really didn't matter given the context. But for Liddick, the obvious warmth that Melissa felt for John raised another more sensitive question. And in her typically blunt way, Liddick didn't dance around it. Even though Melissa was sitting there right next to her husband Tom, Liddick looked right at Melissa and said, "Were you having an affair with John?" Melissa instantly went red and said no. She said they were close friends, but nothing more. Liddick turned to Melissa's husband Tom. He looked very uncomfortable, but Liddick didn't care. She asked him the same thing, is Melissa having an affair with John? For a second, Tom didn't say anything, and Liddick wasn't really sure what to expect. This kind of question could be so offensive to some people or just plain hurtful. But when Tom spoke, he didn't sound angry or upset. He refused to answer Liddick directly and instead just kept repeating over and over again that he really needed to leave to go take care of the kids. And that persisted, basically, for the rest of their interview. He just didn't answer her question. And so by the time Liddick just wrapped it up and told Melissa and Tom why they could go, Tom had firmly established himself, at least in Liddick's mind, as a clear person of interest. Before Liddick left the station for the day, she checked in with one of her police officers who she had sent to go observe the autopsy of her victim. The officer told her that the forensic pathologist had determined that the killer had used a one-sided blade to repeatedly slash John during a fight that must have been at least a few minutes long. John had clear defensive wounds on his hands as well as cuts on his back, which suggested he tried to run away. And in addition to the knife wounds, his jugular had also been cut by glass. It was an absolutely brutal way to kill someone. Everyone that Liddick and her officers had spoken to had described John Wyolinski in glowing terms. He was a simple guy who loved classic movies and old music and liked to dance the polka, even though he was terrible at it. At his dental practice, his favorite patients were the kids who he could always make laugh. He was a devoted dad who loved going to his stepson's hockey games. It just didn't square with the violence described in the autopsy report. Somebody had hated him enough to basically hack him to death in a wild frenzy. Corporal Liddick felt like she had one very good suspect in Tom Wyolinski. I mean, he had acted very suspicious in the interview because he didn't answer the question about the affair. You know, maybe he thought his wife was having an affair with John and that's why he attacked John. However, because Liddick had never done a homicide investigation before, she was very weary of not focusing too hard on one lead or one suspect. She wanted to keep her mind open and make sure she didn't miss anything. Also, she wanted to appear capable in front of her superiors and show them that she was running down every possible lead. And this brought up another concern that Liddick had, and that was she didn't want to share her investigation with any other police agency. The officer who had gone to the autopsy had come back with John Wyolinski's fingernail clippings, blood samples, and tissue samples, which Liddick was supposed to send to a state police lab for DNA testing. But now that Liddick had them, she didn't want to give them to anybody else. And Liddick was a pretty stubborn person, so to keep her investigatory options open and to guarantee that she knew every single thing going on with her evidence, she decided not to send the samples to the state police lab. Instead, she put them in the department refrigerator and went home. The following day was April 15th, 2 days after John Wyolinski was murdered, and Corporal Liddick had decided to start her day at John's dental practice. Speaking to his colleagues, she had already had her officers canvass John's neighborhood. That's how she had gotten a witness statement about the fight over a loan, and also she had heard about the rumors centered on the Wyolinski family. Now she wanted to know how other people in John's life viewed him. And as soon as she arrived at John's office, she was glad she had come because the dental hygienist and the receptionist had a lot to say about John's soon-to-be ex-wife, Michelle Wyolinski. This was because during the long, awful, drawn-out fight John and Michelle had over their divorce, Michelle had at some point lodged allegations against John that he abused their adopted son, JJ. Even Michelle's own family hadn't believed her, and officials had declined to press charges. But at one point during the back and forth, Michelle had also accused John of violating a stay-away order, and police had come and arrested him at work. John's colleagues thought Michelle was a total nightmare. She called the office all the time to demand money, and John often caved and gave it to her. In fact, one of the hygienists told Corporal Liddick that Michelle had called just a few days before the murder. However, this time John had refused to speak to her. This detail caught Liddick's ear. A lot of John's friends had described Michelle as money-hungry. They said it was Michelle who wanted the huge house and the pool, and that John really never felt comfortable living in such a nice place. He still drove an old car with 100,000 miles on it. It was like when he got rich, he didn't know how to act rich, but Michelle definitely did. And John's friends and colleagues said that was a big part of what ultimately drove the couple apart. Now, Liddick did not believe Michelle was physically capable of murdering John the way he was killed. I mean, clearly John was overpowered and brutalized. However, she did have enough money to potentially hire someone to do it for her. And adding more credibility to that theory, Liddick's team had just pulled the paperwork on John's life insurance policy, and they discovered that it listed Michelle as the beneficiary. And with his death, she stood to inherit more than $1 million. The dental hygienists and the receptionist at John's practice didn't know of any other money disputes John was having, and they said he got on well with his business partner regardless of any conversations they might have had about, splitting up their practice. Their suspicions were aimed squarely at Michelle, and now so were Corporal Liddick's. She was not ready to write off Tom Wayuse. I mean, he was clearly a main suspect, but it sort of felt like she now had two major suspects, Tom and Michelle. As Liddick left the dental office, she thought about how she was going to approach Michelle, given the sensitivity of the fact that Michelle was dating a cop. Liddick did not want to make her move too soon without enough ammunition. After all, this was the biggest case she had ever worked. Reporters were calling her constantly. Everybody was asking her about it. And so the last thing she wanted to do was act prematurely and screw this thing up. John Wiolinisi's funeral was held on Wednesday, April 19th, 6 days after his murder. And Corporal Liddick knew that his friends and family were already beginning to get antsy about why this investigation seemed to be moving so slowly. But she did understand where they were coming from. After all, John himself had been convinced he was about to be murdered and that the case would never be solved, and he was very vocal about it. And so Liddick could see that it was starting to look to the people that loved him like his prediction was coming true. But Liddick also felt like John's friends and family simply didn't understand. Liddick was being careful, not just slow. She was a perfectionist and she wanted to do the investigation her way, without any departmental guidance on how to actually work a homicide. She had developed a method of her own. She knew that some homicide detectives like to start their investigations with the people closest to their victim, but Liddick was going to focus on the outside edges of the case and work her way in. She felt like this was the most methodical approach. So for the next several months, Liddick did that and took her time. The crime scene unit had not turned up any matchable DNA or fingerprints at the scene, and the bloody footprints they found didn't belong to any of Liddick's suspects. Liddick still had not turned in the evidence she had stored in the Blairsville refrigerator, so for now she was relying on interviews. Liddick ran down every single tip and rumor she found, systematically ruling things out one by one. She had heard talk that John's partner in the dental practice wanted to stop working together, so she questioned him but quickly ruled him out. Just like the hygienist and the receptionist at the practice had said, the men were close friends with no bad blood. They just maybe didn't want to work together. Liddick had heard lots of talk about how generous John was, so she tracked down every single person she could who John had lent money to. One of those people was John's cousin, Tracy Jacobs. Tracy had borrowed $20,000 to start a lawn care business. And so Liddick brought Tracy down to the station to take a lie detector test. But Tracy passed. And as spring became summer, that was just how it went. Liddick brought one person after another down to the station, made them take lie detector tests, and then scratched them off her list. As she did this, she kept tabs on her best suspects, Tom Wayuse and Michelle Wiolinisi. But she made no move to arrest either one. Sometimes the complaints from the public and from John Wiolinisi's family about her failure to solve the case quickly did get to her, but she felt like she was doing the best job she could do. She was doing this maybe a little bit unorthodox, but she felt like she was on the right path. That was until Melissa Wyuse hired a pair of psychics. It was the summer of 2006, about 3 months after the murder, when Corporal Liddick got a call from Melissa. Wyuse? Liddick had been surprised to hear from Melissa, and even more surprised when Melissa told her she wanted to meet at John's house. When Liddick showed up, Melissa was standing on the sidewalk with 2 older women who she introduced as psychic sisters. She said she had met them at a psychic tea party and they had visions about this case. Now Liddick, admittedly, was not thrilled at the idea of psychics potentially getting involved in this case. I mean, she felt like, how could they possibly advance this case? You know, she was already all over it. Why do we need them? But she also knew that John's family was getting really edgy and, apparently, they had given Melissa permission to bring these psychics into John's house and look around. And so if Liddick wanted more time to work on this case, she just needed to placate them. And so if that meant working with psychics contacted by one of the suspect's wives, then that was what Liddick was going to do. So Liddick trailed Melissa Wyuse and the psychic sisters, tried not to roll her eyes as the sisters began walking through John's yard. First, the sisters said they felt some hot and also cold patches on the property. When they walked up the stairs and went inside, they looked around the house, which had not been cleaned out after the murder, and said they thought the killing happened in the dining room area, which was still spattered with blood. The psychics said they saw a knife and stab wounds and a bloody footprint. And then they said the killer drove a black or red car and that the killer was not Melissa Wyuse's husband, Tom. Melissa looked visibly excited by everything the psychics were saying, but Liddick thought it was totally ridiculous. The blood inside the house made it pretty obvious where the killing had happened, and the huge police investigation that followed had been all over the news. And so the things they were pointing out about, what could have happened in the house were sort of public knowledge. And then the fact that these psychics, who, remember, Melissa herself has brought here raw, like she's commissioned these psychics, are now exonerating Melissa's husband was just not very convincing. And so as the group walked out of the house, the only thing Liddick thought these psychics had been good for was taking some of the pressure off her slow but steady investigation. She knew that by this point, John Wyolini's family had lost faith in her, but she still had one more thing she wanted to try. She just needed to wait for the right time. And 10 months after the murder, in February of 2007, Corporal Liddick got her chance. John's cousins made an impassioned plea to the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office to take over the investigation from Corporal Liddick. Liddick's cooperation with the psychics had bought her a little bit of goodwill and time with the families, but ultimately, both John's family and Melissa Wyuse had gotten more and more agitated by Liddick's slow pace. They began to feel like the psychics had given them as much information as Liddick had, and the Attorney General agreed not enough progress was being made. This meant that Liddick was losing her case. And on one hand, this was exactly the thing that she'd been most worried about, that some bigger agency would come in and take over her investigation. But the Attorney General's office was not the agency Liddick had expected to do that. And so now, even though it stung, Liddick realized that she could finally make the play she had been sitting on for almost a year. She went to the refrigerator in the Blairsville police station and she took out the container of fingernail clippings that her officer had brought back from John Wyolini's autopsy, which had been conducted the day after the murder. Liddick had been supposed to send the fingernails along with the other tissue samples to the state police crime lab, but in what she knew was probably a breach of protocol, she had not done that. Instead, she had hidden them in this fridge. But now, with the Attorney General very publicly stepping in and getting involved in this case, it sort of made the case much more high profile, which in turn allowed Liddick to send these samples directly to the Federal Crime Lab, or the FBI Crime Lab. Normally, the FBI would just not take samples for a small-town murder case, which is what this was all the way up until this point. But again, the case was not that anymore. The Attorney General stepping in and taking over had elevated this case, giving Liddick access to the FBI crime lab. So she repackaged the fingernail clippings and sent them off to the FBI, and waited. The day that the results came in, Liddick was very nervous. There was a chance that she was about to look very stupid for sitting on this evidence for as long as she had. But as she sat at her computer and opened up the email with the DNA results, when she read what was on the screen, her eyes went wide. She almost couldn't believe what she was looking at because her strategy of slow playing the investigation had totally paid off. Finally, Liddick was looking at the name of John's killer, based on evidence collected at the crime scene and then tested by the FBI. The following is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened to John Wiolinisi in the early hours of April 13, 2006. The killer drove through Blairsville in their red car sometime after 12:00 a.m. A little after 12:00 a.m., they drove down a quiet residential street and pulled up to a modest little brick home and then cut their lights. They climbed out of their car and looked around to make sure nobody was watching, but the neighborhood was dark. As quietly as they could, they crept around to the back of the house and slipped inside, going through an unlocked back door. They walked through the kitchen, then the dining room, and into the living room where they found John asleep on the couch. The killer gripped a single-edged knife in their fist and they raised it in the air and then brought it down on John. Instantly, John woke up screaming these horrible, high-pitched screams. He put his hands up to protect himself and clawed at the killer, getting their skin under his fingernails. But the killer kept slashing and cutting at John's hands, so John rolled off the couch, desperate to get away. As John stumbled in the dark, the killer chased after him, and at some point they began to wrestle, knocking the divorce papers on the coffee table onto the floor, where John's blood splashed all over them as he flailed his wounded arms. John finally broke away and ran for the front door, but the killer was close behind, still slashing at John's back. John made it out of the living room and into the foyer, and he was reaching for the front door when the killer shoved him. John's head broke through the glass and he made a strangled sound as the broken shard severed his jugular. The killer yanked John back into the house, wary of waking up the neighbors. By now, John was already clearly dying, but the killer decided they couldn't leave anything to chance, and so with one brutal motion, they slashed their knife all the way across John's throat. The killer let John slump to the ground and then they watched until John went still. Then the killer turned and left the home. The killer was confident they would never be caught because they knew the police in Blairsville quite literally trusted them with their lives. John's killer was not Tom Wayus or Michelle Wiolinisi or a hitman hired by Michelle. However, the killer was connected to Michelle. It was Pennsylvania State Police Trooper Kevin Foley, Michelle's new boyfriend. And this fact explained the unbelievably slow pace of the murder investigation and Corporal Liddick's decision not to send all her evidence to the state police crime lab. Liddick knew Kevin Foley and she liked and trusted him initially. She had not wanted to believe he could be a killer, but as soon as her investigation began, she began to hear about how much Foley seemed to hate John. In fact, he talked openly about wanting John to die, in part because of the allegations that Michelle had made that John abused JJJJ. Even though those allegations were ruled unfounded, it seemed that Foley still believed them. Liddick had become increasingly paranoid that Foley was the killer and that her case would be taken over, not by the Attorney General's office, but by the state police. And she was afraid that if Foley was guilty, then she couldn't trust the state police crime lab. And so, to keep complete control over her investigation, she had opted to keep all those samples from the autopsy, including the fingernails, even though she knew they likely contained the DNA of John's killer. Then she slow-played her investigation, basically biding her time until she could figure out what she was going to do. And then, basically, her hands were tied when a year later the Attorney General came and took the case over. Because basically Liddick looked like she was being incompetent. But when they stepped in, they gave Liddick access to the federal crime lab, the FBI crime lab. And so when she sent the samples off to them, not worried about Kevin Foley getting involved, the FBI scientists finally tested the DNA under the fingernails and found that it was a match for Kevin Foley. Foley was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Michelle was not charged in connection with the case. And now, here's our first story called No Reservations. On a Sunday morning in 1993, 42-year-old Roberto Nunez was on his daily run through his hometown of Granada, Spain. And as usual along this route, he ran past delivery trucks parked outside of restaurants, and kitchen workers carried crates of food from these trucks into the back of the restaurants to prepare for the day's meals. Now, Roberto had never really paid these restaurants much attention. You know, he was an athlete, and to him, food was just fuel, not some delicacy. But that morning, right after passing by the restaurant and smelling the smells of the food, he happened to run past a local bookshop. And for whatever reason, something in that bookshop caught his eye. It was a fine dining cookbook beautifully displayed in the front window. And for some reason, Roberto stopped his run and just stared at this cookbook book. Something about the meal on the cover just looked irresistible. He was so drawn to it, he could almost taste the food in his mouth. Moments later, Roberto found himself inside the bookstore, asking for a copy of that book. As the shopkeeper went to go get a copy of this book, Roberto wandered toward the culinary section of the store and began flipping through the other cookbooks. By the time the shopkeeper returned, Roberto had a whole pile of them in his arms. When Roberto left the bookshop, he couldn't run anymore because of how heavy all these books were he just bought, and so he walked his way home. And then when he got home, he lined up all of his beautiful new cookbooks on his kitchen counter and just stared for a second, marveling at all the food on the covers. Then he went to his refrigerator to grab a container of yogurt, his usual breakfast. But now, as he stared down at the cup of plain, unflavored goop, his tongue seemed to recoil inside of his mouth. He felt like he could almost taste the plastic container and metal spoon before he even took a bite. Suddenly, Roberto's everyday breakfast seemed totally unappealing. And so, for the first time in his entire adult life, Roberto decided to take himself out for breakfast. He walked to the nearest open cafe and read their extensive menu, and all the items sounded delicious. Unable to choose, he just asked the server to bring him the most popular dish and one of every side dish on the menu. 20 minutes later, Roberto's little cafe table was so full of plates he could barely find a spot to set down his espresso mug. Roberto stuck his fork into a potato omelet seasoned with chives and garlic. He took a bite, and it felt like his tongue was exploding with pleasure. He'd had all these foods before, but they had never triggered a response like this. He felt a rush of joy as he leaned over his cafe table and devoured every bit of food his stomach could fit. A few weeks later, Roberto was pacing in his kitchen on the phone, making reservations at one of the most exclusive restaurants in Granada. For the past couple of weeks, he and his wife had been eating out for almost every meal. Roberto didn't know what had come over him. He'd never been a food person, but now he was spending nearly all his time researching the best restaurants in Granada and then making plans to dine at each of them. Meanwhile, his running shoes sat abandoned in his closet. In fact, he hadn't gone running even once this week. Roberto was a marathon runner, but his heart just was not in running anymore. He totally stopped counting calories and monitoring his carbohydrate and protein intake. His only long-term goal at the moment was a grand European road trip so he could try all the famous restaurants he'd been reading about. In fact, calling a travel agent was the next item on his to-do list. He intended to eat at every single Michelin-rated restaurant in the entire world. Roberto finalized another restaurant reservation and then hung up, marking the appointment on his calendar. And then he called the next restaurant on his list. For years later, Roberto sat at his computer typing up a restaurant review. By this point, his entire life now revolved around food. Every free second was spent eating, planning to eat, or traveling to the best restaurants all over the world so that he could write about them. Roberto looked a lot different now, too. Roberto had really not been running at all over the past few years, and between that, his sedentary lifestyle, and new love of gourmet food, he'd gained a good 60 pounds. He'd had to buy a completely new wardrobe, but Roberto didn't mind. He'd actually never had so much fun in his life as he had now being a foodie. The passion he now felt for food rivaled the sense of accomplishment he used to feel at the end of marathons. It was like he had finally found his real life's purpose. Roberto sat back in his home office chair and closed his eyes, trying to remember the subtlety of a glaze he tasted at lunch. He breathed in deeply, then sat up looking around. He breathed in again, and a warm, savory scent filled his nostrils. His entire apartment was suddenly filled with this heavenly aroma, even though he wasn't cooking anything at all. It took him a minute to place this wonderful smell, and then he had it, It was his mother's cooking, a spicy potato dish she used to make him when he was a kid. Confused, Roberto went to the kitchen, wondering if maybe his wife had come home and started making dinner without him noticing. But no, the kitchen was dark and empty. So Roberto wandered the house, running scenarios through his mind that might explain the smell. At first, he thought, maybe a window was open and outside smells were coming in. But when that wasn't true, he began to wonder did somebody break in and were they eating inside of his house? Now, he knew that made no sense. But the more he wandered the house, the stronger the smell of his mother's cooking became. But there was no reason for it to be in his apartment. It just made no sense. Roberto was feeling freaked out, especially when moments later, the smell changed from delicious to sour. He stopped and covered his nose as a chemical-like odor filled the apartment. But even with his nose covered, he could still smell it. Worse, he could taste it on his tongue. He gagged a little, then went to the kitchen to spit in the sink. He flung a window open trying to air out the smell, and then as quickly as the smell had come on, it disappeared. Roberto stood in his living room feeling very unnerved, trying to tell himself that there had to be some irrational explanation. He told himself that it must have been a neighbor cooking a familiar recipe and accidentally burning it on the stove. But despite his best efforts to convince himself that that really happened, he still felt very unsettled as he went back to his computer to finish his review. A month later, Roberto was at a local cafe enjoying one of his favorite breakfasts, a potato and chorizo omelette with a side of fruit and some bread. He just finished lathering the bread with some butter when his nose caught a whiff of that same savory scent he had smelled inside of his apartment. The smell was his mother's cooking, specifically her huevos rotos, a traditional Spanish breakfast she used to make when he was a kid. Roberto looked around, wondering if the smell was coming from a neighboring table, but he was the only one with a plate of food. Roberto picked up his espresso and breathed in deeply, knowing the smell of coffee beans can clear your palate. But when he set the cup down again, that smell was still there. Roberto told himself not to panic, but he was worried. He decided that perhaps it was time to see a doctor about all these phantom smells. A few days later, Roberto was at a neurologist's office explaining how he was smelling all these things that weren't actually there. And he was concerned that he was losing his mind. Now, the neurologist didn't want Roberto to panic, but he did think Roberto might be experiencing smell hallucinations. And they're rare, but very real, and they can be the sign of something dangerous. The doctor explained that smell hallucinations can be caused by head injuries, upper respiratory infections, and in some cases, brain tumors or Parkinson's disease. Roberto did his best to stay calm. He didn't know what he'd been expecting when he got here today, but certainly not being told he could have a brain tumor or Parkinson's disease. The neurologist could clearly read the fear in Roberto's eyes because he immediately told him, don't worry. They'd run some tests and narrow down the possibilities, then figure out what was going on. They'd start by ordering an MRI. Roberto nodded, still feeling very uneasy. And a few hours later, his unease quickly turned to fear as the neurologist showed Roberto his MRI scan and pointed to a long, slender tumor on his right temporal lobe of his brain. Roberto felt petrified as the neurologist explained that the tumor was called a fibroblastic meningioma. It was putting pressure on Roberto's brain and causing him to have these smell hallucinations. The doctor explained that they'd have to surgically remove this tumor. Roberto felt a surge of adrenaline as he imagined himself undergoing brain surgery. He was gonna be sick. He bent over, his arms on his knees, trying to catch his breath. And at the same time, the neurologist assured him that they would take very good care of him. The doctor said he would be with Roberto every step of the way. Roberto stood up and nodded. He knew he needed to call his wife and break the terrible news, but then after that, he would call his favorite restaurant to get takeout for dinner. He was in the mood for some comfort food. A few weeks later, Roberto was at home on his couch watching his favorite cooking show on EVE. His head was still bandaged from his 14-hour brain surgery, which his neurologist said had been a success, and Roberto had been making slow but steady progress in his recovery. As he flipped through the channels, the mouth-watering smell of roasted chicken suddenly filled the room. And for a second, Roberto was terrified. Was this another smell hallucination? Did the surgery not work? But then he looked up and saw his wife enter the living room carrying 2 plates of roasted chicken, his dinner. His stomach rumbled, and he thanked his wife as she set his plate down on the coffee table and helped him sit upright. Roberto had not had a single smell hallucination since his surgery, and he was hoping that that meant he was cured. And so, feeling like he had a new lease on life, Roberto looked forward to getting back to his food blog and the long list of restaurants he still wanted to try. 12 years later, on March 3, 2010, Roberto, who was now 58 years old, stood on the scale at his neurologist's office for a routine follow-up. Even though it had been over a decade since his brain surgery, he still had to get regular MRI scans to make sure there were no new tumors in his brain. The nurse took note of Roberto's weight. By this point, Roberto had gained approximately 110 pounds since he first took an interest in food, but this just didn't really bother him. He knew he'd been gaining weight steadily over the years because, after all, he ate rich and decadent foods for almost every meal, something he just loved to do. And besides, his career in food had really become quite incredible. Roberto was now a widely recognized and respected food critic. He wrote for prestigious magazines and gastronomy guides and had been featured in a few newspapers. After that day's scan, Roberto waited inside of his neurologist's office, expecting the same results he got after every other appointment. All clear and good to go. Except this afternoon, his neurologist did not look too happy when he came through the door. He told Roberto that the MRI today showed a growing lesion and mild damage in the same areas where his tumor had been, and he believed that the lesion was likely left over from his surgery a decade ago. Roberto was shocked and asked the doctor if this meant more brain surgery. But the neurologist assured Roberto that this lesion was small, so small in fact they could very likely manage it without having to resort to surgery. Instead, they would do something called radius or unial, which is when very focused beams of radiation are used to treat cancer cells and other tissue without any incision. Roberto liked the sound of that and scheduled the radius or uni for later that week. A month later, Roberto parked his car along the street in Granada and adjusted his tie. Then he opened the passenger door for his wife, and the two of them began walking up the sidewalk on their way to a restaurant opening. And as they strolled along the boulevard, Roberto told his wife the good news. He'd had a follow-up doctor's appointment at his neurologist that afternoon. He'd completed his radius or uni appointments at the start of the month, and now his neurologist told him that his lesion had shrunk by more than 25% and was no longer pressing on his temporal lobe. His neurologist felt optimistic that the lesion would soon be gone and Roberto would be in full remission. As they neared the restaurant, Roberto's wife gave him a kiss and told him this was fantastic news. She was so relieved. Then, the hostess led Roberto and his wife to their table and removed the shiny gold reserved placard. As they sat down, the new restaurant was buzzing with anticipation. It was chock full of well-dressed diners, all clearly looking forward to an excellent night of food. A server came out to pour wine, and moments later, Roberto's first course was set down in front of him. But for some reason, it didn't look appetizing. He stared down at the food, trying to conjure some of the excitement he'd been feeling just moments ago, but he couldn't have been less interested. In fact, he kind of just wanted to leave and go home and get a good night's sleep. But Roberto was a professional, so he made himself eat every course they brought out to him. However, later that night when he was working on the review, Roberto had to admit that his heart just wasn't in it. And so, for the first time in more than 15 years, food just didn't really interest him. And the next time Roberto saw his neurologist, he learned why. It would turn out the tumor and lingering lesion pressing on Roberto's temporal lobe, known as the amygdala, was what had caused not only his hallucinatory smells, but his extreme interest in food. The pressure from the tumor created a brain injury which, in very rare cases, can trigger up as a brain and eating disorder called Gorman syndrome. People who suffer from this condition can literally become completely obsessed with fine dining. They become preoccupied with food and sometimes become compulsive eaters, even if they had formerly been very health conscious. And That's exactly what happened to Roberto. Once Roberto's tumor was removed and the lesion was finally reduced, Roberto's love for food basically completely faded. However, despite that, Roberto did not give up on his career. He kept working as a food critic, even if his job was not nearly as enjoyable as it was before. And now, here is our second and final story of today's episode, called The Bitter End. One morning in 2022, a 64-year-old woman named Beth shuffled into her kitchen in Ontario, Canada. It was early, and so Beth was still wearing her pajamas. She opened up her kitchen window to let fresh air blow inside, and as she did, she took in a deep breath and smiled. Beth always reminded herself not to take life's small pleasures, like a cool summer breeze, for granted. She grabbed a loaf of whole wheat bread off the counter and put the slices in the toaster. Then she opened her fridge and pulled out a container of green juice and a couple of organic eggs. Beth was extremely health and diet conscious and usually had the same breakfast every morning. She drank 2 glasses of juice while her toast cooked, and she scrambled her eggs. Then she sat at the kitchen able to eat. When she finished, she put her dishes in the sink and walked back to her room to get dressed for her morning job. But as she was trying to decide what shirt to wear, Beth felt this dull pain in her lower abdomen. At first, she was able to ignore it, but then the pain got sharper, and Beth suddenly was clutching her stomach. And then she felt weak, and a wave of nausea made her rush from her closet to her bathroom, where she vomited and then had diarrhea. Beth shakily walked to the sink and drank a few sips of water from the tap. When she looked in the mirror, she saw that her face was betrayed. She could feel her heartbeat thudding in her throat, and so she brought 2 fingers up to her neck and began to count her pulse. And she found her heart was absolutely racing, and it really scared her because she had high blood pressure, and so she knew, at any point something could go wrong with her heart. And so suddenly Beth feared she might be having a heart attack. She stumbled back to her kitchen, she grabbed her landline phone off the counter, and she dialed 911. Less than half an hour later, Dr. Jacob Adams heard a siren blaring as an ambulance pulled up outside of the University of Ottawa's Montfort Hospital. A paramedic hopped out of the back of the vehicle and rushed into the emergency room, shouting to the doctor that, "Hey, we have a patient who's in shock here." Was in shock here room? And so Dr. Adams immediately ran with the paramedic out towards the ambulance, knowing he had a very sick patient on his hands. Shock occurs when a person doesn't have enough blood circulating throughout their body, and left untreated, it can rapidly lead to organ damage or even death. And this patient, Beth, was already in bad shape. The paramedic said that she was vomiting, she had diarrhea, and her blood pressure was dangerously high. Another paramedic followed closely behind the first, and together they brought Beth into the emergency room on a gurney. Dr. Adams saw how pale and confused she looked and knew there was no time to waste. He directed the EMT to wheel Beth into the nearest exam room, while the other paramedic briefed him on Beth's medical history. They told the doctor that Beth had been relatively healthy until today, but she had been taking medications for two conditions. High blood pressure and a thyroid deficiency that can leave patients feeling tired and looking pale. Otherwise, she was taking no other drugs. She didn't even take vitamins or over-the-counter supplements. The paramedic said Beth had deteriorated right before their eyes. When they first arrived at Beth's house, she was able to talk to them about her fear that she was maybe having a heart attack, but since then, she had gotten so much sicker that now she could barely talk. Dr. Adams nodded and thanked the paramedics for bringing her in. Then he watched as their nurses went to work on their very unstable patient. One nurse checked Beth's temperature, another inserted an IV needle, and a third wrapped a blood pressure monitor around her arm. At first, it showed that Beth's blood pressure was elevated, but suddenly it plummeted 100 points. Beth's arms went limp, and she looked like she was struggling to breathe. And so within seconds, Beth's blood pressure had gone from being dangerously high to being so low that she could lose consciousness any second. Dr. Adams took one of Beth's hands and squeezed her fingers, making her skin turn white. He waited for the color where he squeezed to come back, but it took an unusually long time. To Dr. Adams, this was extremely worrying. It meant Beth's blood circulation had become dangerously sluggish. Before they could do anything else, Dr. Adams knew he would need to stabilize Beth's condition. He asked a nurse to start her on an IV fluid drip, and almost as soon as the fluids entered Beth's bloodstream, her blood pressure started rising and her breathing returned to normal. After a few minutes, Beth began to speak, albeit in a strange voice, saying that her stomach was killing her. She said she kept getting these horrible sharp cramps in her lower abdomen. Dr. Adams assured Beth they would figure out what was going on, but they had to perform a lot of different tests as quickly as possible to do that. And so he told her the best thing she could do was try to stay calm and just focus on her breathing. Beth looked scared but nodded her head in agreement. Then Dr. Adams called in 3 different medical technicians who all surrounded Beth. One of them took vials of her blood, another examined her abdomen with an ultrasound machine, while the third performed an EKG to test her heart function. Meanwhile, Dr. Adams stood off to the side and considered all of his patient's symptoms, and he began to think about a couple of different things that could have caused her to go into shock. Maybe she was having an allergic reaction, or maybe she swallowed some kind of poison, or maybe she was fighting a severe infection. Now the first 2, allergic reaction and poison, weren't enough to address right now, but the severe infection could be treated right away. So Dr. Adams called for a nurse to start Beth on broad-spectrum antibiotics, hoping this would stop a potential infection in its tracks. While a nurse gave Beth a dose of antibiotics through her IV tube, one of the medical technicians finished taking Beth's blood. Dr. Adams told him to have the blood tested for signs of infection and also to run an emergency toxicology test to see if there were any traces of poison inside of Beth's body. At almost the same time, the ultrasound technician pulled up black and white images of Beth's digestive system onto a computer screen and told Dr. Adams that they didn't see anything out of the ordinary, like fluid buildup or a bowel obstruction. However, the technician who was doing the EKG had much more ominous news. They said the left side of Beth's heart was working much harder than it should have been, a sign that her heart was not functioning correctly. It could mean that the right side of her heart was failing, and so, as a result, the left side was trying to make up for it, which Dr. Adams knew could easily put Beth's life in danger. But alarming as the EKG results were, they didn't help Dr. Adams determine what was actually causing Beth's intense distress. He needed to get a better understanding of how all of her internal organs were functioning, so he decided to bring her into the radiology department for a CT scan, which would take pictures of the inside of her body. The scan only took about 15 minutes, but it revealed that Beth's problems went beyond her heart. Dr. Adams saw that her small intestine showed signs of inflammation or even a possible obstruction. Though the earlier ultrasound of her abdomen had looked normal, the doctor no longer believed that was accurate. He could tell from the more detailed CT scan that something was wrong after all. And suddenly Dr. Adams had an alarming thought. Maybe Beth was bleeding internally inside of her digestive system. Severe internal bleeding could explain a lot of Beth's symptoms, including nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and her sudden drop in blood pressure. But this would be a terrifying diagnosis. If Dr. Adams didn't locate and stop the bleeding right away, Beth could bleed to death. A few minutes later, Dr. Adams received the results of Beth's blood work. Her toxicology report came back normal, meaning technicians had not found any poison in her system. But, on the other hand, the results showed she did have elevated levels of a protein found in red blood cells, which did seem to indicate she did have internal bleeding. And just as the doctor set her test results aside, Beth's blood pressure suddenly plummeted again. She went pale, and her breathing became labored. Dr. Adams looked up and noticed her IV fluid bag was empty, so he quickly replaced it with a full one. And as soon as the fluids flowed into her system, just like the last time, her blood pressure immediately stabilized. But to Dr. Adams, this was not a good sign. If Beth was rapidly bleeding internally, IV fluids would keep her going for a while, but eventually it would not be enough. And so, she needed a blood transfusion as quickly as possible. And at this point, Beth looked sicker than ever. She groaned in pain and then leaned over the side of her hospital bed and vomited up blood. Now Dr. Adams was certain that she was bleeding internally into her stomach, which was why she was throwing up the blood. He immediately called in a nurse who began giving Beth a blood transfusion. He also continued giving her IV fluids and started her on drugs that would keep her blood pressure up and reduce acid in the stomach to hopefully slow the bleeding. After all that, Dr. Adams transferred Beth to the intensive care unit, where they met with a gastrointestinal specialist named Dr. Christina King. Dr. King said she needed to insert a tiny camera down Beth's throat and into her abdomen. That way she could see firsthand where the blood was coming from. Dr. King turned to Beth, whose face was scrunched up in pain, and explained the procedure. Beth would be put under light anesthesia for about 30 minutes, and during that time, Dr. King would insert a tube with the camera on one end into Beth's esophagus and down into her stomach. Beth looked uneasy, but she was so sick that a tube going down her throat seemed like a small price to pay for some answers. She said okay, and the doctors got to work prepping her for the procedure. About 15 minutes later, Beth had been put under anesthesia and was lying on her side on a bed in her ICU room. Dr. King stood beside her and carefully inserted the long, thin tube down her throat. Dr. King could see the inside of Beth's esophagus on a screen right beside her bed. Dr. King moved the tube further down Beth's digestive system, and as soon as the camera entered Beth's stomach, Dr. King saw that her stomach lining was swollen, red, and bleeding. The bleeding was not severe, but the doctor knew that was only thanks to the drugs that Dr. Adams had given Beth. Later that afternoon, Dr. King sat in the ICU with Beth, who was still sedated from her procedure. Beth did look much better than she had just a few hours ago, and Dr. King was glad that the treatment she and Dr. Adams had come up with seemed to be working. Her internal bleeding had largely stopped, at least for now, and so for the time being, Dr. King could really focus on why Beth was bleeding internally. Dr. King was starting to think that Beth's illness had been caused by something that she might have eaten, rather than by poison or an infection. And so, once Beth woke up from her procedure, Dr. King asked her if she'd eaten anything out of the ordinary that morning before she had gotten sick. Beth initially said no. She'd had the same breakfast she ate every single morning: whole wheat toast, organic eggs, and homemade green juice. However, Beth said, now that she thought about it, her juice had tasted a bit more bitter than usual. Dr. King asked what kind of juice it was, and Beth said, she made it herself from a type of green squash called bottle gourds that she had bought at the store. She'd heard that bottle gourds were really great health food, and so for the last several years, she'd been pureeing the vegetables into a juice that she would drink every morning. Dr. King just stared at Beth because suddenly she knew what was going on with Beth, and it made perfect sense. Beth had given herself a nearly fatal case of toxic squash syndrome. It's a very rare condition that results from eating poisonous chemicals sometimes found in squashes and gourds. These toxins are called cucurbitacins, and they taste very bitter. Over hundreds of years, people have bred squashes to have only trace levels of these toxins. But sometimes the plants can still develop high amounts of cucurbitacins as they grow, and people who eat a lot of those types of vegetables can get dangerously ill. Beth went to her local grocery store and unknowingly bought bottle gourds that did contain a dangerous amount of these toxins. Then she pureed the vegetables and drank the juice, and the only thing she noticed was a slightly bitter taste until just minutes after breakfast. The toxins caused her stomach lining to start bleeding, and Beth went into shock. Her case was the first of its kind ever reported in Canada. After 5 days in the ICU, Beth was finally healthy enough to return home. 2 weeks later, her doctors called to check on her condition, and she told them that she was feeling fine, except for one symptom in the past few days. Her hair had begun falling out. Her doctors told her that this was actually normal. Delayed onset hair loss had been reported in a number of cases of toxic squash syndrome. Despite her hair loss, which was actually only temporary, Beth would go on to make a full recovery and go back to her normal life. Though, she found another kind of juice to drink at breakfast.